Well, as we continue our study of the book of Judges, last week we introduced the character of Samson. And we talked about how he is the last deliverer for the nation of Israel in the book of Judges. We talked about his story a little bit, introduced it. We looked at chapters 13 through 15, verse 8. Tonight we're going to cover the rest of chapter 15 and chapter 16 and conclude the story of Samson. So if you recall, Samson was the only deliverer who wasn't called directly by God. His mother was called, right? So an angel of the Lord appeared to his mother, the wife of Manoah, and she was barren, and he said that you're going to have a son. And so this son would be the deliverer of the Philistines, that he was to take a Nazirite vow from his birth all the way to his death. In fact, she was held to that standard of not eating anything from a vine. And so there was this really special, event that occurred. And so if anyone was prepared to be a great deliverer of the nation of Israel, it was Samson. And so we talked about that. We got into chapter 14, and we saw that the first thing he did was he picked a Philistine wife. So a little disappointing to the parents because he's supposed to deliver them from the Philistines. And the reason he said is because she looks good to me, or she's good in my eyes, as some of the translations said. And so he chooses this wife. The parents are upset, but they pretty much go along with it, right? Samson is determined. Samson's impulsive. Samson is unteachable. And we start to see some of these characteristics come out in him. And what was the reason, right? I remember if you remember back in chapter 15, there was a reason that God was allowing this to occur. These characteristics in Samson. Do you guys recall what it said in chapter 15? Chapter 14, I'm sorry.
He was looking for an opportunity to put the Philistines down. God was looking for an opportunity to put the Philistines in their place.
Yes, yeah. So if it says in verse 4 of chapter 14, however, his father and mother did not know it was of the Lord, for he was seeking an occasion against the Philistines, so to put him down. And we'll see even more in this study how the Philistines and the Israelites had sort of just melded into their society. I mean, they'd accepted living amongst them. And God wanted to put a wedge between the people of Israel and the Philistines. And so that was going to be Samson's calling, right? And so it's interesting how God works through people to accomplish his will. And that's exactly how this plays out, because he's determined to marry this woman. He goes to see her. He's on the path. A lion attacks him, and the Spirit of the Lord comes on him, and he tears this lion apart like a baby goat, right? Just tears him apart. And then comes back later on another trip, passes by, sees the carcass, and in the carcass is a honeycomb of all things, right? And he stops, and rather than passing by, he takes some of the honey and eats it, and then he gives it to his parents, and they eat it as well. And we talked about the Nazirite vow, how that would make him unclean. Didn't really tell his parents about that. So it reveals some characteristics about him. He goes to a wedding feast. He proposes a riddle to the 30 companions that are his, or at least appointed him by the Philistines, probably to watch over him. And he proposes a riddle to them, right? Out of the eater comes something to eat. Out of the strong comes something sweet. I've got a riddle, and there's no way they can solve it. And so these guys are easy marks. I'm going to get 30 changes of clothes. And the Philistines have a little different idea. They threaten his wife, his bride, wherever she was at that stage. And finally, on the seventh day, Samson gave in and told her. And the men confronted him and told him as well. So he was pretty angry that they kind of used her to get his riddle. So he goes and kills 30 Philistines and takes their clothes and says, here's my payoff of your bet. And so the conflict continues to escalate. We get into chapter 15. That's where we can kind of conclude it. And he returns for his wife. Some time went by. He thought, you know what, I'm going to go back. I want to see her. So he goes to the house, and the father says, well, I gave her away to one of the companions that was with you, one of the Philistines. So again, he got pretty upset about that, and goes and burns the crops in a very interesting way, gets 300 foxes or jackals, the scriptures say, and ties their tails together and puts a torch in between them and sets them out across the fields and the stalks of grain and burns them up. The Philistines are upset, and so they find out that Samson's mad because his wife was given away by her father. So they have this notion of, well, let's burn her and her father. And so that was what they did. And so then Samson found out about that, and he retaliates, and he kills, it says, many Philistines in a great slaughter. So a lot of killing, a lot of escalation. God's purpose is kind of playing out, right? There's a division that's being set up here between the Philistines and the Israelites through Samson. So we want to pick up today in chapter 15, verse 9. So that's where we left off. And so if you have your Bibles, let's look at Samson chapter 15. We'll read verse 9 through 13. It says, Then the Philistines went up and camped in Judah and spread out in Lehi. And the men of Judah said, Why have you come up against us? And they said, We have come up to bind Samson in order to do to him what he did to us. Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Edom. This is where Samson was hiding after he killed all these Philistines in his revenge. And they said to Samson, Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you have done to us? And he said to them, As they did to me, so I have done to them. So they said to him, We have come down to bind you so that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines. And Samson said to them, Swear to me that you will not kill me. So they said to him, No, but we will bind you fast and give you into their hands. Yet surely we will not kill you. Then they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. And so we start to see really the evidence of acceptance and complacency, right? I mean, here's 3,000 men of Judah. They're confronted by the Philistines looking for Samson, and here's their deliverer. And what do? Do they make a stand? Right? Yeah, they just like, we're going to sell him out, right? So, and it's interesting that they're asking, like, what do you got against us? And they said, we came here to get Samson. So 3,000 men, okay, 3,000 to 1, right? That's maybe the odds that these guys probably feel are about fair with Samson. And so they go down, the Israelite brethren from the tribe of Judah go to approach Samson, and they pose this question, don't you know that the Philistines are rulers over us? Why are you causing all this trouble? Why can't you just let it be, right? So they want to just make peace. They don't want to cause any trouble with the Philistines. And it's just kind of interesting, I think, when you look at verse 10, I noticed this, the men of Judah asked, why are you coming up against us? And they said, we've come to bind up Samson in order to do to him as he did to us. Okay, and then in verse 11, the men of Judah go to Samson, and they say, what is this that you have done to us? And then he said to them, they did to me, so I'll do to them. So everybody's really worried about themselves, isn't it? Aren't they? I mean, the Philistines want revenge. The men of Judah are worried about what have you done to us? And then Samson says, well, I'm just going to do to them what they did to me. So that's what kind of everybody doing right in their own eyes is. That's kind of the world, right? It's just this. And so I think the author really kind of shows this state of dysfunction, right, of what's going on. And it's just interesting how it's presented and worded that nobody seems to be doing right here. And this, as we're going to see, it doesn't really end well. It's usually this whole retaliation stuff. It never really ends well. Somebody goes a little bit too far or something bad happens. But Samson agrees to be bound, if they don't kill him. So I don't know if he's afraid of them or if he's probably just thinking that he's going to use this as an attack. We don't really know his mindset, but nevertheless, they bind him, they take him, And then we pick up in verse 14. So they have him together, they bring him to Lehi, and the Philistines shouted as they met him. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, so that the ropes that were on his arms were as flax that is burned with fire. And his bonds dropped from his hands, and he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, so that he reached out, took it, and killed 1,000 men with it. And then Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I killed 1,000 men. And when he finished speaking, he threw the jawbone from his hand, and he named that place Ramah Lehi. Then he became very thirsty, and he called out to the Lord and said, you've given me this great deliverance by the hand of your servant, and now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised. But God split the hollow place that is in Lehi, so that water came out of it. When he drank, his strength returned, and he was revived. Therefore he named it in Hakor, which is in Lehi to this day. So he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. So the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him, and then some bad things are going to happen, right, to whoever's in his way. And in his way are these Philistines, and he picks up a jawbone of a donkey, a fresh one, so meaning it's in a carcass, right? Again, it's sort of a dead body. It's not decayed completely, so, but also it's not brittle. And so, I got to thinking, well, how effective would a jawbone of a donkey be as a weapon? So I thought it'd be good just to illustrate. I mean, it might be a pretty effective weapon. You can kind of see where you could grab it down by the base, and then you could probably do some damage. But think about killing 1,000 people with just that. So, it's obviously the strength of the Lord, but that's interesting. That's the weapon that he chose. And so he slaughters these men, and then he kind of says something like a song, if you will. And it says, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps. So think about 1,000 men just piled up, right? I mean, I'm just trying to think what this scene looks like. And it's not going to be a nice, neat scene. It's got to be blood and gore and just gouging people with this thing. I've killed 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey. So just going back to Deborah and Barak, right? Chapter 4 was the story of them, but then chapter 5 was the song. And so if you recall what that was about, it recounted all the events that had occurred in chapter 4, but it was through a different perspective. And what was that perspective about, if you guys remember? Okay, Deborah praising God. So there was a theme of giving God praise. The victory came through God. And so that comes out in the song, and it's a whole chapter, right? Several verses. And so Samson has kind of a song of his own, but there's really no mention of God, right? So I almost look at it like, obviously he's glorifying himself, and I think that I'm guessing that maybe there's additional people around, and that's kind of trash talking, right? That's how I look at it. He's like, I've made heaps of your people, and I killed 1,000 with a jawbone donkey, and kind of taunting them, I think. That's my guess. I don't know the scene, but I could see that kind of thing occurring in his mind, as again, we're trying to get some characteristics of Samson. So he becomes thirsty, he calls out to the Lord, and so what do you think of his, I don't know that this is a prayer, it's more of a statement, I think, to God, I don't know. What do you think about this? When he says to God, how he approaches him. He says, you've given me this great deliverance by the hand of your servant, and now shall I die and fall in the hands of the uncircumcised. So maybe there's something there, he's acknowledging that the deliverance was given by God, but does that seem right? What do you guys think, Mark?
I think that, he has been proven himself as far as having this mighty name that can do a lot of things, his strength and his power. But
Yes. Yeah.
He's mortal just like anybody else.
Absolutely.
He needed life.
Yeah. Vance, go ahead.
Kind of makes you wonder if he even makes the statement at all if he's not thirsty in that moment. Is he only saying this because he's finding himself in need, and it's sort of like I need water, and then he's going to start by saying, yeah, God can deliver me, but it's sort of backhanded, but.
Yeah, I mean, what's driving it is my thirst, right? And concern for myself. There's no concern for the people of Israel. I mean, in any part of the story of Samson, right, which typically you'd see the deliverers really kind of having a more noble cause. And you know, I'm really kind of hammering Samson here, but it's leading to a point. So, Carrie.
It's possible, I think, the difference when how to say that is he allowed the Jews or the Hebrews to bind him.
Yes.
And in so doing, he takes the battle directly to the Philistines, so his own people are not injured. I don't know if that was the motive or not. That's the way it
Yeah, possibly. I mean, certainly that was the outcome. There was no, bloodshed within the nation. I mean, he just sort of, and that was the other thing unique about him. He never fought with an army. He just always fought by himself. Every man he killed or any confrontation, it was by himself. So, so it's interesting to, kind of speculate on that, but God graciously answers him, doesn't he? He provides the water, right? Even though maybe the tone wasn't right. I mean, think about us, right? I mean, do we complain to God? And God is continually gracious to us. So I mean, that kind of strikes me a little bit. Sometimes we make statements like this to God, and then we have these blessings that come. And like Mark said, I mean, we're all human, and we can see how some of the things and characteristics that Samson displays, we've probably done in our lives too. It says he judged for 20 years, but during Philistine control. So there was really no deliverance, right, from the Philistines. It said that he judged, in verse 20, Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. And there was conflict, but there really wasn't any change. And so it's just an interesting observation. A little different than some of the other stories of the judges. So that's chapter 15, and we'll kind of look at now at chapter 16. Any thoughts before we move on to chapter 16? We're going to kind of conclude the story here.
I was thinking that it must have been crazy 20 years with this guy judging and having the kind of self-serving attitude that he had. I don't think it would have been totally out of character for him to be humble at that point.
Yeah.
And so I just would almost think there would have been still a lot of chaos. He would have been right at the center.
I think people probably viewed him as a great warrior, and he was the tough guy, right? Nobody wanted to mess with him. Samson had a reputation, but it's interesting that God takes flawed people and he uses them and he gives them time. 20 years, right? I mean, you would think, well, this character, God should just run him out and get somebody better, a little more righteous. But yeah, how is this going to work? Like he's the great deliverer. Yeah. And how many times do we doubt God, right? I mean, it's not going like how it's supposed to go. But as we've got to read the whole story, right? And so that's sort of the rest of the story is chapter 16. And so we see in chapter 16, and we just see verses 1 through 3. So let's look at that. Now Samson went to Gaza, which is the capital city of the Philistine nation, and he saw a harlot there, and he went into her. So when it was told to the Gazites, saying, Samson has come here, they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the gate of the city. And they kept silent all night, saying, let us wait until the morning light, and then we will kill him. Now Samson lay until midnight, and at midnight he arose, took hold of the doors of the city gate and the 2 posts, and he pulled them up along with the bars, and he put them on top of his shoulders, and he carried them up to the top of the mountain, which is opposite Hebron. So we kind of see this pattern continuing, right? This story kind of links to the past, and then it links to the future. So the past is his marriage to the Timonite woman, the Philistine. The future will be Delilah, right? But in the middle, you've got his little interlude with a prostitute, and he goes and has a fling here. And so we're starting to see a weakness for women. You know, again, this impulsive behavior, enticed by danger, reckless. I mean, I guess these things sort of appeal to him. And think about it, if you have that kind of strength, you can do anything you want. He goes to the capital city, spends a night with a prostitute, surrounded by guards in a walled city. That doesn't sound like a very good idea. They have him surrounded. He just tears the doors of the gate, and he puts him on his shoulders, and he carries him to the top of the mountain. So Gaza's at the more the sea level shore, and he carries it almost 40 miles as the crow flies on the top of a mountain. So, I mean, I don't know what he was trying to prove, but it was pretty interesting that he does that. I don't know if that's another way to just kind of make a statement to the Philistines, like, you can't control me, and I'm going to take all of this and I'm going to put it on the top of a mountain deep inside the Israelite territory. I don't know, right, Jessica?
Well, not only had he made a statement with that, but he also made the city vulnerable.
Yes,
You
that's true. It's true. Yeah.
He's like, all right, I'm going to just go, I'll take this with me, so good luck trying to keep fighting any riffraff.
Yeah, and I'm not going to just tear it off and leave it next to the wall. Yeah, I'm going to take it 40 miles away. So it's interesting, you know, when you kind of get an idea of how far and what he did with that. So, but this pattern's escalating, and you see this, like, he becomes increasingly emboldened by his success, right? That's what I see in Samson. A little bit more risky, a little bit more danger. He relies on his strength given by God to tear off these doorposts and do what he did. And I just asked this question, what about us? Can success be a problem for us? Because that's what I'm seeing with Samson. Like, he's blessed with this great strength, and it's an incredible gift, right? And I think about that in success and gifts and blessings. Can those sometimes be a problem for us in our service to God? What do you think, Dana?
I think his issue is that he has no appreciation for what has happened being from God. And so in our world, when we do have some success, we need to stop and realize that that's because God has made that available
Yes.
to us. And then maybe you're a little more successful or you achieve something else, and you need to stop and think that's because God has made that available, given me that opportunity.
And I don't know if this is part of what the scripture is trying to teach us, but I look at a couple things. God's grace, right? So God is, in his grace, he even takes our weaknesses and our failures, right, through his grace, and he uses them to help us see his dependence on him. And if we truly are in tune, right, and understand. But then the great gift of God's grace combined with man's sinful nature, what you can get is this. We'll also take the gifts of strength and blessings that God gives to us in grace, and we'll use them against him, right? We'll find ways to use God's blessings to maybe ruin our lives, is what Samson's doing here. Self-reliance, self-dependence. And think about the times when, you know, you're connected with God. Is it times when you're really struggling and there's a need for God, or is it when you're just super successful and everything's going well? Is that when you're really wanting to go and approach God? And can that be a problem, I think? What do you think? Is that something that can be a hindrance to us? Any thoughts? Justin, you good?
It totally is. It's like I would hope. I mean, I'm certainly in younger years. I'm not as thoughtful about things like that. But
Yeah.
I find myself as reflecting more on things
Which song are we singing? Are we singing the song of Deborah and Barak, or are we singing the song of Samson, right, and success, right? Because, I mean, we all, come on. Sometimes we can boast a little bit, right? Or feel good about ourselves. But I think that's an interesting thought to take away. Like, how are we processing that? The blessings and the success. I mean, we know how to process weakness, and we know how to process failures. We approach God, right? And we really try to connect with him. But God's grace isn't always going to just give us that. It's going to give us other things too. So, Ian.
I think what's kind of interesting is like you talk about, in my opinion, he has an ego problem. And I say that as a person who has an ego problem as well.
Sure, yeah.
Somebody who has more or less gotten away with everything.
Yes.
And it's through the Lord's help. I don't want to say he's facilitated with doing evil, but it says the Spirit of the Lord was with him during these occasions when he's violating his vows, when he's acting recklessly, on and on, and it's coming to a head as we read on. But I guess what was interesting to me was when we read about Saul, Saul was rejected. Samuel comes to him and says, "You're not God's chosen anymore. That's it. It's done." And still after that, the Spirit of the Lord came on him, and he was prophesying, which is why they said, "Does Saul even one of the prophets?" Right? The Lord had rejected him, yet the Spirit of the Lord came on him and allowed him to prophesy. This is the same issue that Samson is going to encounter, and what
Yeah.
we can encounter today. The fact that we are still successful by God's blessings
Yeah.
is not indicative of us having God's favor or doing God's will.
Yeah.
He
Okay.
is going to accomplish what he wants to accomplish, whether we are found in his grace, so to speak, or not.
Sure.
And this is exactly what's going to happen with Samson in this story. So I think the important part is
Interesting.
not measure your success as a measure of how God looks upon you, but take that, of course, as a blessing. But check yourself. Am I doing what the Lord wants me to do?
Yeah, my success isn't necessarily a validation of my service to God, right, or my standing to God, right? So, no, it's a great point. Some people will preach a different message out there in the religious world, but let's look at verse 4. Let's kind of keep the story going after the whole episode with the prostitute. It says, after this time came about, he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, and her name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said, entice him and see where his great strength lies and how we can overpower him, that we may bind him and afflict him. So then we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. So there's money in this for you. And so she says to Samson, please, this is great. I love this, is a ridiculous question. Please tell me where your great strength is and how you may be bound to afflict you. So Samson said to her, if they bind me with, I guess he gives an equally ridiculous answer, right? Sure, we're going to play a game here? Sure, I'll play. If they bind me with 7 fresh cords that have not been dried, then I'll become weak like any other man. And then the lords of the Philistine brought her up 7 fresh cords that had not been dried, and she bound him with them. And she had men lying in wait in the inner room, and she said to them, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And he snapped the cords as a string of tow snaps, and when it touches fire, and so his strength was not discovered. And so this goes on. We don't need to read every bit of this, but it happens 2 more times, right? She asks him again, and he gives her a false answer. She asks him again. He gives her a false answer. One is again with ropes. The other one is he weaved my hair and put a pin in it. And so I think he's just sort of playing a game with her. I don't know. It's just strange. This whole episode to me is very strange. Yeah, I'm smarter than you. I don't know. Like, yeah. He didn't remember about his riddle, right? Kind of thought that too, but that's a little later. No, I know. Like the ridiculous question. I was just like laughing when I read that. Yeah, so So then she decides to take another angle, right? And so in verse 15, she said to him, "How can you say you love me when your heart is not with me?" So boy, that's never been used before, that line. So you've deceived me these 3 times, and you've not told me where your great strength is. And it came about when she pressed him daily with her words and urged him that his soul was annoyed to death, so that he told her all that was in his heart. And he said to her, "A razor has never come on my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I will become weak, and I will be like any other man." Then Delilah saw that he had told her all that was in his heart, and she sent and called the lords of the Philistines and said, "Come up once, for he has told me all that is in his heart." Then the lords of the Philistines came up and brought her the money to put into her hands, and she made him sleep on her knees, and she called for a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his hair. Then she began to afflict him, and his strength left. And she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And he awoke from his sleep, and he said, "I'll go out as at other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. Then the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes, and they brought him down to Gaza and bound him in bronze chains, and he was a grinder in prison. So, wow, all of a sudden things change, right? It's like in this little compressed passage, his life changes. So it says in verse 4 that he loved Delilah, right? I don't know, it didn't say that about his first wife. She looked good to me, and the prostitute probably looked good to him, but it says that he loved her. So I kind of thought about this, what kind of love is that, right? Is it one of self-enhancement? Getting what she can give me that's why I love her, versus self-giving, what I can give another, right? Maybe the love that we really should aspire to as husband and wife. Kind of what I see is they're using each other, right? Samson kind of uses her for really sexual love, the attraction, the mystique, these Philistine women. Maybe there was something about her personality, but what can I get? And we know what she was using him for, right? For the money. And probably for the prestige. I mean, she's dealing with the lords of the Philistines, so if she can deliver Samson, she's going to have fortune and fame. So that's kind of her motivation. So they're kind of using each other. It's just interesting. And he goes along with it. I mean, you basically have 2 vain and narcissistic people in love. What could go wrong, right? So Delilah knows his secret. It's time to cash in. And it was interesting in verse 20. I kind of looked at that and thought, I wonder, Samson obviously knew his hair was gone, shaved. I mean, I would think, right? I don't know. But he awakes, probably realizes his hair's been shaved. And he says that I'll go out just like before. But he had told her he had been incrementally breaking his Nazirite vow, right? As we've been documenting in this story. But then he says to her, but boy, if you cut my hair, that's it, right? So, I mean, how did he make that connection? Or did he really even believe that? I wonder, maybe that's what would do it. I'm not really sure. And because I can't read anywhere where it's told to him, like, if you cut your hair, that's what's going to take the strength. So I don't know if that was told, who knows. But my point is, I just feel like that self-reliance died. Well, even if my hair is gone, I'm just going to go out, and like I was before. And all of a sudden it says, not so much that his hair was gone, but that the Lord had left him. He did not know that the Lord had departed from him. It's gone, right? It's gone. The Spirit of the Lord is gone, right? All the grace is gone. So now it flips, right? They gouge his eyes out, they bind him, they put him in prison. And so at this point, I don't think things can really get any worse, right? He goes from invincible strength to humiliating weakness, and that just in an instant. And for the first time in the book of Judges, God's deliverer has been defeated. Think about that. He's the only deliverer that's been defeated. And so, yeah, there's a lot in this story. But we read on, right, in verse 22, however, the hair of his head began to grow again after it was shaved off. Now the lords of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice. For they said, our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hands. And when the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, our God has given our enemy into our hands, even the destroyer of our country, who has slain many of us. So it happened when they were in high spirits, they called and they said, call for Samson that he may amuse us. So they called for Samson from the prison, and he entertained them. And they made him stand between the pillars. So just when you thought couldn't get any worse, it's just gotten worse. Now they want to call him and make sport of him. And now they're saying it was our God that delivered him. And he had the strength of God. He knew he had the strength of God, and that his failure is what caused all this. And so he's having to deal with all of this. So God brought him low and then brought him just a little bit lower, right? And to the rock bottom. And so, what comes to mind is the scripture, 1 Corinthians 10:12, right? I mean, the Apostle Paul, therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall. Okay, so that kind of comes to mind, right? But then what about verse 13? No temptation has overtaken you, but such as common to man, and God is faithful and will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it. So that's what follows. Now what's interesting, I got to thinking, what if you substituted the word weakness for temptation? And I'm not trying to rewrite scripture, but just go with me on this and let's read it, okay? Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall. No weakness has overtaken you, but such as common to man. And God is faithful and will not allow you to be weak beyond what you're able. But with the weakness will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it. And so I kind of inserted that and read that, and I thought, well, maybe that kind of does apply to Samson, right? God's brought him low, and it's not to just absolutely snuff him out and humiliate him and tell him, you failed, and I'm going to make you pay, and you're going to be humiliated, and that's the end of your story. Well, the end of the story isn't done yet, right? And so we get to the end of the story, and there's more to come. So in 28, verse 28, he's between the pillars, and the house of the, let me see, in verse, let me get my spot here. Then Samson said to the boy, verse 26, who was holding his hand, let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, that I may lean against them. Now the house was full of men and women, and all the lords of the Philistines were there. So all these guys that wanted him, that paid the money. And about 3,000 men and women were on the roof looking on while Samson was amusing them. Then Samson called out to the Lord and said, O Lord God, Jehovah God, please remember me and please strengthen me just this time, O God, that I may at once be avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Samson grasped the middle pillars on which the house rested. He braced against him, one on his right and one on his left, and Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. And he bent with all his might so that the house fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those he killed in his life. Interesting, the way the author puts that, the way the story plays out. And tragic, but just there's a lot there, right? His greatest accomplishment was at his death. His greatest accomplishment came when he was the weakest. And so there's a lot there, right? Then it says in verse 31 that his brothers and all his father's house came down, took him, brought him up, buried him between Zoar and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah, his father. lest he judge Israel for 20 years. So we read in Hebrews chapter 11 about Samson being listed as one of the examples of faith. And you read the story and you're like, okay, where did I miss it? I mean, so he's listed with Gideon, Barak, and Jephthah, David, Samuel, the prophets. I mean, Samson. So where do you think Samson in this story deserves a recognition here by the Hebrew writer calling that? Because the people who were Jewish Christians would know about the stories of all these characters. What would it be that would appeal? What do you think?
I think it's right at the end when he gives God the glory of knowing that that's what his power is. The whole time it's all about Samson. And then finally at the end he says, okay, I get it, it's you.
Yeah.
Let me do this with your power.
Think about the difference between his prayer to God, or I guess this really is a prayer, versus what he said earlier, right, about being thirsty, about how he approached God. And so he's humble, remember me, right? He didn't say that when he was thirsty. He just said, I'm thirsty, and now I'm going to be handed over to these Philistines. And then a dependence, strengthen me. Just this one time. And both times he says, please, pleading to God. And so we finally see that dependence, right? And so God answers, and we really see, I think, it's this from weakness we're made strong. We saw that in Gideon too, right? But Gideon was a little bit different story, a little bit different way. And we saw the problem with Gideon being weak initially and then being strong later, and having that strength kind of corrupt him a little bit, right? And if you remember that story, there were no armies that he led or anything like that. But Samson is a man who had weakness as a result of his strength, but then ended up being strong as a result of his weakness. And so it's kind of this unique story. And I look at 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. We talked about this with Gideon, where Paul, he had his thorn in the flesh, and he had prayed to God that it be removed 3 times. God's answer to him was, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. So really, Samson's power was finally perfected in the state of his weakness. That's why he was mentioned in Hebrews 11. I don't think it was because he slaughtered people with the jawbone of a donkey. I think it's this acknowledgement. It was this power that was perfected. It was there, but it became perfected. Most gladly, therefore, Paul says, I'd rather boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. And so we made this statement before. God's power is most fully active and displayed when we're weak. And that just doesn't make any sense. That's part of the things that don't really make a lot of sense about the scriptures, right? But when you really understand being weak is when we can really connect more with God. We can have dependence upon God. We understand. And so it's just interesting when we look at the story of Samson and we chronicle all of this buildup of his terrible character and everything. But then there's this redeeming quality about him at the end. Janine, did you have your hand up?
Let me be avenged for mine eyes.
Yeah, so there's always that, right? So, we're all flawed, I think, even to the end. But I just think it's always interesting that he's mentioned there in Hebrews, right? He's in this passage for a reason. And you read that story and you wouldn't think he'd make the cut, but I guess it's where God's grace allows us, even to the end, to redeem ourselves. And that's what he did at the end. And it's kind of sad because he could have been so much more. Yes, go ahead, Roger.
He had obviously a lot of issues along the way, but he put his faith in his strength from God.
Yeah.
To put all his battles. Who else
Yes.
He didn't, people with David was went against Goliath, right? Which obviously was huge.
Yeah.
But he didn't go against 1,000 people, or kill 1,000 people.
No, not on his own.
I mean, everybody, he had John, everybody else, God, went down to a few hundred people to go to war. People say it was dead, kept dwindling of his numbers. But he went out by himself.
Yeah.
It took anybody.
Yeah.
He relied on God's strength that he gave him to attack anybody. He had a lot of flaws, obviously. I mean, that part I think kind of went through the whole book where he always relied on God's strength that he gave him. And then finally came where he humbled himself to the Lord.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that popped in my mind is that I think he knew about God, right? He understood and he knew the Nazarite vow and that God was with him. Kind of like we are sometimes, right? Well, no, God's with me, but then it was really just the self-reliance that took over until right at the end, and that's when he really acknowledged God, when it was really like, no, it really is God. And it took him to get to that point. So anyway, I think it's an interesting story for us to look at. We're going to pick up next week. We're going to look at chapter 17 and 18, the story of Micah and the Danites. So the next 5 chapters are really not about judges. It's an interesting look into the character of the Israelite people at this time. So 17 and 18 is what we'll cover next week. Okay? Great. Thank you, guys.